We have two special guests today. We have Kim Watts, Assistant Minister or Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, and he's also Labour MP from Gillibrand constituency, I think, in Melbourne. He's an MP from 2013. He is also the author of two books. He holds a master's degree, LSE in the UK. So he will be the leader in the conference. And we also have Ambassador Patricio Powell, former ambassador to Australia between 2017 and 2022. Okay, so Ambassador will be commenting on Tim's presentation. So, well, this is a very important topic. Australia has a new Labour government elected in May this year. So it's very interesting that they're in the campaign trail. Foreign policy was a top issue, so which is quite unusual in politics. So, Minister. Okay.
Thank you. Am I on here? Okay. Well, thank you to the Institute and to the University of Chile for having me here today. It would be traditional if I was giving a speech in Australia to start an address like this with what we call an acknowledgement of country. And this is a recognition of the traditional Indigenous owners of land that we meet on in Australia. So if I was speaking to you in my home electorate in Melbourne's West, I would begin by saying, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I give my respects to their elders past and present. So today, as a visitor to Chile, I want to express my respects and acknowledge any Indigenous Chileans who are with us here today. I also acknowledge, the Director Lopez, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today, Deputy Director Dockendorf, the Institute's teachers and students, of course. And it's a pleasure also to be joined here by Ambassador Powell, who I had the pleasure of meeting yesterday. It's great to be able to see you again so soon. Likewise. I thank all of you for your attendance today. During my flight here from Australia, I had time to reflect on the vastness of the Pacific Ocean that connects our two nations. It was a wonderful reminder that when it comes to genuine friendship, geography is no obstacle. And Australia and Chile are genuine friends. We work together on a range of issues. We invest in both directions, and we travel to each other's countries to work, to study, and holiday. Australia is also home to a thriving Chilean diaspora, including in my hometown in Melbourne. It is one of the 300 ancestries that we are proud to call home. And in Australia, we see ourselves as a multicultural modern nation that shares common ground with people around the world and links with almost every country on earth. In my own electorate in Melbourne's West, 2/3 of my constituents, my voters, were either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. This is the normal reality of Australia as a migrant country. And this connects us with countries all the way around the world. In the case of Chile, though, our link is unique. You might know that a few months ago, Australians elected a new Labor government led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Our new government is younger even than the new government here in Chile. However, you might not know that more than a century ago, in 1904, Australia elected the first national level government led by a Labor Party, led by my party, a party of the trade union movement. And that party, that government, was led by John Christian Watson, or Chris Watson, as he was known. And Chris Watson has the curious distinction of being the only Australian Prime Minister in our history who wasn't born in Australia or in the British Empire. Chris Watson's father was Johann Christian Tank, and he was a Chilean German. And Watson was born here in Chile, in Valparaiso. Watson became Prime Minister at the age of 37, not much older than President Boric when he took office. And to this day, Chris Watson remains our youngest Prime Minister. His portrait sporting a very handsome beard that he was very proud of, quite similar to President Boric's handsome beard. His painting hangs in our caucus room to this very day, and he remains a unique part of the story of Australia and Chile's long relationship. But his story is an illustration of how countless individual stories of Australia's history of immigration and multiculturalism connect us with every country in the world. Today, our two nations are connected by thousands of tourists, students, holidaymakers, and migrants, building the relationship between our countries through countless people-to-people connections in a new era in which the values we share are more important than ever. Today, our unstable global economic circumstances have exacerbated inequality, with the economic shock of the pandemic affecting those who can least afford it the most. In this world, Australia and Chile's interests and priorities are more aligned than ever, and we have the opportunity to work together to face many challenges of our time. Australia and Chile are working together on trade issues, ensuring that any trade is free, fair, and open, benefiting citizens of both of our countries. The rules-based international order is being challenged on multiple fronts today, not least by the destabilising effects of Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. And together, our two countries understand that strong multilateral institutions are essential for security, prosperity, and stability. We've worked particularly closely together in the past in support of those institutions, those multilateral institutions, including APEC and the WTO, and including as members of the Cairns Group. In particular, Australia works closely with Chile in multilateral and regional forums like the UN and APEC to support women's human rights in the face of some countries' efforts to undermine long-established agreements on these rights. And of course, there is the existential challenge of our generation, the challenge of climate change, which I'll focus on today. The Australian government believes that climate change is the single biggest challenge to our region and to our world. And I know that that's a view that the Chilean government shares. In Australia, the new government has legislated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a minimum of 43% by 2030. And like Chile, we've committed to reducing net zero emissions by 2050. We're committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We've made these commitments because we know that how we face climate change and what we do or what we don't do will have existential ramifications for the very future of life on our planet. As I mentioned earlier, the Pacific Ocean connects our two countries. It feeds us, it shapes our weather, it affects our economies. It's fundamental to our way of life. As a country with one of the largest and most distinctive coastlines in the world, Chile knows this all too well. Australians too have a pretty strong affinity with the water. 85% of our population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. We have magnificent beaches, including in my electorate in Melbourne. We have the third largest area of mangroves in the world, and some of the world's largest coral and rocky reef systems, including, of course, the world famous Great Barrier Reef. Recognising the importance of our waters, some 4 million square kilometres of Australian waters, about 45% are marine protected areas. The oceans are also our biggest carbon sink. They are home to more than half of all life on Earth, hosting rich ecosystems that contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. And the biodiverse plant life that lives in our oceans, mangroves, marshes, algae, seagrasses, make up blue carbon ecosystems that sequester 2 to 4 times more carbon per hectare than terrestrial forests. These ecosystems are so vital in the Pacific. They provide protection from extreme weather events, they mitigate against the impacts of rising sea levels, and provide greater food security and sustainable livelihoods. But they are also incredibly vulnerable. Climate change, plastic pollution, coastal development, destructive fishing practices, all of these put our oceans' biodiversity and health at risk. And that in turn risks reducing our ocean's capacity to sequester carbon, creating a dangerous feedback loop. To protect them, we need to invest in nature-based solutions, to decarbonise ocean industries, to end plastic pollution, and to harness ocean-based renewable energy. And that work is already well underway. Australia coordinates the International Partnership for Blue Carbon, a global network of 50 partners to accelerate implementation of blue carbon restoration activities. Chile, as a member of the Americas for the Protection of the Ocean initiative, is working to create marine corridors from Canada to Chilean Patagonia in the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Organisation. Together, we are working through the Ocean Panel, a unique group of 17 world leaders advocating for strong, practical solutions to help the world transition to a sustainable ocean economy. And at the 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly in February 2022, our countries joined the global fight to end plastic pollution and to negotiate an international treaty by 2024. And as members of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People and the Global Ocean Alliance, Australia and Chile are advocating for a global target to protect at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. In Australia, we've also set a national goal to protect and conserve 30% of Australia's land by 2030. In talking about our 30 by 30 targets, I'm reminded very strongly of President Borich's turquoise foreign policy agenda, combining the blue of the ocean and the green of the environment into one, recognising that it is all connected. Australia, like Chile, recognises the climate crisis presents an opportunity, and our countries are already collaborating in this space. Australia and Chile lead the world in the mining of critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, and silicon, all essential in the technologies that we need for a sustainable future. Australia, like Chile, is seeking to become a top global supplier of green hydrogen by 2030, with our two countries working together to significantly increase research and development resources to kickstart green hydrogen production globally. And many of the green hydrogen projects that have been proposed or are under development in Australia under development in Chile involve Australian companies. There is always more that we can do, and I'm looking forward to seeing our relationship in sustainable mining and renewable energies grow. And the maintenance and protection of our waters and our environment is something that First Nations people in Australia, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders alike, as well as our Pacific partners in the Pacific family, have long championed. Indigenous peoples are key climate action stakeholders. As a country committed to democratic values, freedoms, and human rights, one of Australia's foreign policy priorities is to advance and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples at home and around the world. This starts by recognising that our own domestic human rights record in this respect is not perfect. It's far from perfect. Australia is home to the oldest continuous civilisation in the world, the oldest continuous culture in the world. A British settlement, which has given us strong institutions and a long-standing tradition of liberal democracy, led directly to the dispossession and deaths of First Nations people, given us a long legacy of injustice that continues today. So one of the first commitments of our new government, in fact, the first issue mentioned by our new Australian Prime Minister on his election night, on taking office, was our commitment to the full implementation of what is known as the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is a historic statement. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is a historic statement signed in May 2017 by more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander delegates from across Australia. It was the product of a multi-year process of coming together of Indigenous Australians to form a consensus of what their ask was from the Australian people and the Australian government, what they wanted to remedy the legacy and the history of dispossession and injustice experienced by their peoples across our country. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for 3 key reforms. It makes 3 asks of the Australian people that I think are modest and humbling. The First ask is for a voice, enshrining the First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution to our Parliament. It calls for makarata, coming together after conflict, what you can think of as treaty making between the Australian government and First Nations. And finally, and most modestly of all, it calls for truth telling the truth about Australia's history for a fair and truthful relationship between Australian and Indigenous peoples. The new Australian government is working towards a constitutional referendum to establish the First Nations voice to Parliament. And we will establish a Makarrata Commission to work with the voice once it is established on a national process for treaty and truth-telling. This agenda is being powerfully led by Indigenous leaders within the new Australian government and within our Parliament. My colleague Linda Burney, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, the first Indigenous woman to serve as a Cabinet Minister in an Australian government. Malandiri McCarthy, the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians from the Northern Territory in Australia. And Senator Pat Dodson, known to all Australians as the father of reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and the broader community, the Special Envoy for Reconciliation and the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, who recently joined Australia's Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong, as our representative at the recent session of the United Nations General Assembly, a historic moment for our country, a moment of great national pride. I know that, like us, Chile's government also recognises the importance of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And while our two nations will walk our own paths on constitutional reconciliation and recognition, I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other's journeys. And we look forward to working with Chile on universal human rights standards, including in multilateral forums like the United Nations. Young people today have inherited a complex and challenging world. It's a lot more complex and challenging than the world that I confronted when I left university at the turn of the millennium. One that Chris Watson, back in 1904, couldn't possibly have imagined. It would have taken Watson's family several months to sail from Chile to New Zealand and on to Australia. Today, you can jump on a plane to get from Santiago to Sydney in about 15 hours. And that contrast reminds us that while the world has become more complex, it has also given us more opportunities than ever before to cooperate and to collaborate in meeting these challenges. And cooperation and collaboration is the only way that we will face the challenges confronting our world today. So thank you for your time today. I hope I've given you some sense of the great friendship between our countries across the ages, and I'm very happy to answer questions and have a discussion with you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and I would like to say that we are joined today by the Australian Ambassador Mercer. So, well, Ambassador Powell, already your turn.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, Minister. And a little bit of a disclaimer: it is impossible for me to be not biased when it comes to Australia. I've been with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 35 years, and I have to say that my experience and my family's experience, personally and professionally, in Australia was wonderful, and it will stay with us forever. Having said that, it's an honor also for me to be here as a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. Thanks to Professor Lopez, to you, Fagendorf, to everybody here, and I see people, to Ambassador Mercer, of course, and I see people like Professor Wilhelmi there, who I'm sure could comment way better than me about this, but I'll try to do my best. Very briefly, Minister, you began with friendship and ended with friendship, and that's something that in my experience and my colleagues' experience is true. And for the younger people here who are thinking of where would I like to take my studies, my interest in international affairs, well, look west. We have friends there, proven friends. That friendship stems from a sustained effort of, I would say, by now more than, well, obviously you can go back to 19th century, but Chile's approach to our friends in the Pacific is now at least, I don't know, 20, 40 years old. People who built this, who were present at the beginning when some people thought about this crazy idea of why not try to have to be an actor, to be there beyond Easter Island, and maybe go back to the time when Chilean ships were exchanging goods and Chilean currency was valid in Tahiti, or when we were in Borneo and in places like that. That has been a sustained effort by Chile, by the government of Chile, and by the private sector, and by academic institutions. And today, when you go to places like Australia and like New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, you realize that they know us and they trust us, which is something that we need to value and we need to cultivate. I don't want to compare, but I will. I landed in Canberra and I started talking to my colleagues, other Latin American ambassadors, and the first thing they tell you is, it's unfair. You guys are always the first ones. And this is coming from the Mexicans, coming from the Brazilians, coming from the Peruvians. And I go, and what do you need? They say, yeah, because Australians, when they think of Latin America, they think of you first. And you are the gateway, and you are the model, and with all the imperfections and all the things that we can add. But there is this perception of we were here first, and we are the model to follow, which is a huge responsibility. When you have people like Brazil, they're powerhouses in agriculture and in certain aspects of applied technology, but not the Mexican who build things for the world. The Peruvians, who are our neighbors and our partners in mining and things like that. And they think of, if you want to deal with Australia, if you want to deal with the Pacific, follow the Chilean model in interacting with our friends on the other side of the water. It's true, and we need to cultivate that. As the minister was saying, I mean, all the elements that he mentioned regarding Australian foreign policy, particularly the current administrations, the Albanese administration, try to find one where we don't have a common element. And this is not a passing thing. I mean, think of gender, think of human rights in general, think of regional peoples, think of the cultures, think of the stewardship of the ocean and what the minister described. Actually, I can't think of anything. Trade. The essential element of democracy and a world order governed by rules. It sounds very basic, but not so much. I have young children, and I thought I knew what the world was going to look like when they're a little older, not so much these days. And when we talk to our friends in Australia, and that's the thing, Australia is obviously a regional power. Australia is connected and active in every single delicate issue in the world, beginning with, the gigantic emerging powers, to taking care of shipping lanes, to nuclear, to everything. They're there. They're in the middle of it. The level of the quality of Australian professionals, academicians is amazing. And they want to talk to people like you. They want to share. One thing that we need to do is be even better known. I mean, obviously, when it comes to mining, when it comes to energy transition and things like that, they know who we are. We're doing things together. Australia, the investment in mining in Chile and all the services associated to that. But we need to have a better presence. I have the pleasure of interacting very closely with the Australian Latin American Business Council in Sydney. They're wonderful. Like their counterpart here, Australian. And the first thing they tell you is that, we need to do something to increase the awareness of the opportunities. With Chile is easy, because we kind of know each other. But even so, we need to be more present as a region. Things like the Pacific Alliance help. Obviously, the multilateral, the regional trade and investment schemes help. But, they need to know more about us, and we need to know more about them. When the minister mentions Aboriginal peoples, First Nations, whatever designation. I mean, we can sit there, we're talking about the same things. Constitutional recognition, the voice, the tricky element in the statement from the heart, the truth telling. It's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, obviously, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia is much more micro. It's hundreds of groupings and bands and mobs. Here is a little easier in terms of we have how many? 11? I'm forgetting how many are recognized. But and we need to remember that Australia being a federal unit, it's different to talk to the federal government than to talk, like, for instance, the Victoria government, and all they do with Aboriginal communities in Victoria in terms of for instance, economic aspects. How do you work together with the Aboriginals in terms of favoring a development? What the mining companies are doing, I think, has been an interesting transition, and it's a conversation that we can have very easily, because in Chile we're doing exactly the same thing. When it comes to energy transition, Australia is talking to the same people we're talking. Australia has a fantastic, like Chile, green hydrogen policy. Australia is talking to the ports, is talking to the people who are developing the technology, who are developing the industry. We're doing exactly the same. So, you know, you just need to get people talking there and talking in person. So the fact that the minister is here, you know, it is 16 hours, it's a 16-hour flight. It'll be 14 hours at the end of October when Qantas reopens the direct links. So what I can say is that we as Chile are very fortunate to have you here. We're very fortunate to have the Australian presence in Chile in all its varying manifestations. And we are Australia's other neighbor to the east. Let's not forget. Thank you, Minister, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Barbara. So I'm sure there are some questions. So we're going to take a couple of questions from the public. Most of them, I think, are undergrad students. So please raise your hand and say your name and year.
Hello, my name is Ursula, and I wanted to ask, in regards to the summertime deaths that we face between Chile and, in this case, the Australian government. I wanted to ask if you could identify what are the current challenges in the Australian society for the implementation of this ambitious plan towards the recognition and reform of Indigenous people, as this is a topic that has been on the discussion of our nation over the past months. And yeah, I wanted to ask your point of view from the Australian society, but identify any challenges and what tools we need to. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, look, I can talk from the Australian perspective, so I don't want to project onto the Chilean perspective because, you know, I'm here to learn. But from the Australian perspective, I think we've had a very big focus on ensuring that there aren't you know, misinformation campaigns based on what's being proposed. So we've been very specific about what we are and what we aren't doing. So we've been very clear that you know, we are responding to the ask of Indigenous Australians of the government on the Statement from the Heart, and they have asked for a voice to Parliament. That is not a veto, it's not a sort of a third chamber of our Parliament. It doesn't sort of create an additional institutional blockage point that can hijack the system. It provides what is called, it provides a voice and a platform for Indigenous Australians to be heard. My view is that that voice will hold extraordinary moral weight. Our Prime Minister has said that you know, it would be a bold government that ignored that voice, but it does not create a constitutional veto point in our system. So I think that's something that we've been very heavily focused on.
More questions, Professor Mihelny.
Thank you, Minister, for a great presentation. I wonder if you could tell us about how the Australian government is seeing the concept of the Indo-Pacific and whether our part of the world, our part of the Pacific is within that concept or outside of that concept, or is the Indo-Pacific frame of reference something that goes beyond security? Is it going to encompass, like the United States recently suggested, an Indo-Pacific economic framework to build on cooperation? I really am very eager to learn about more about the Australian perspective, considering especially that Australia was the first country in a white paper some years ago to talk about this.
Yes, it is a favourite topic amongst international relations scholars in Australia and in our immediate region to debate the meaning of the Indo-Pacific, where the boundaries are, how we should conceptualise it. I think in Australia it's conceptualised as a strategic system where the impactors are interacting with each other and having an impact on each other's actions. I've heard many arguments in Australia that the Indo-Pacific should extend to the east coast of Africa and encompass the whole Indian Ocean system there. Some others say it should extend across to the other side of the Pacific as well. Look, I think the thing that we would say in Australia is that we're not a global power, but we have global interests. So while the focus of our resource investment and our engagement is in our immediate neighbourhood, so in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia, are the big focuses of the new government, we recognise that we have global interests too. And global problems can't be solved without global engagement, particularly through the multilateral system. So we think that regardless of how you define the Indo-Pacific, Australia still has a role engaging with regions like Latin America, like Africa, for that matter, because there are some problems, like climate change in particular, that we cannot solve on a sub-regional basis, that we need the entire globe working together. But while the Indo-Pacific was coined in Australia, I'll leave it to the international relations scholars to argue over the specific boundaries of it.
More questions?
My name is Vanessa, and my question is about what appreciation Australia has of China as an international actor that is part of the Global South, especially with the relationship that China has with Latin American countries in the context of the interaction of Global South.
So China is obviously a very significant nation. It's increasingly engaged in South America as it's increasingly engaged in Africa, the Middle East, everywhere in the world. Australia's own relationship with China has been a subject of a lot of attention in recent times. And what the new Australian government has said is that it's in the interests of both Australia and China to stabilise our relationship in the face of some recent difficulties that we've had. We've taken some immediate steps to do that. We've had meetings between Prime Minister Wong and the Chinese Minister Wang Yi. And we've said that we'll be calm and consistent in advocating for Australian interests in that context. So we've had consular issues with China. We've had a number of trade blockages with China. And we've had some differences of opinion on human rights issues, particularly with respect to Xinjiang and Hong Kong. The new Australian government has said that we won't stop talking about issues that matter to the Australian people in that context, and we'll continue to raise them in those bilateral meetings that I've talked about before, and where appropriate in public as well. But when we do so, we'll be calm and we'll be consistent in doing so.
We have a question from our colleague online. Professor Portales.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Minister, for your very good presentation. I would like to raise just a brief 5 points in order to look at the future of our relation. I think that Chile and Australia have worked for a long period, medium period, on trying to find the same kind of coincidence and outlooks. We have been part of APEC, we have worked in the CPTPP, and we have looked at more or less the same principles, even in subjects like the law of the sea. So I was reading yesterday a very interesting article about your foreign minister, and she combines very wisely the look for principles and prudence. And I think that that outlook give a very good prospect for a conversation between our two governments. I think that would be very important. And looking beyond, we have to start talking about the future of Antarctica. It's several years still the renewal of the treaty, but I think we also share a lot of interest in that. The second point is related to interconnectedness. And since here there is an interest in a cable, excuse me for being so specific, between Chile and Australia to connect Chile with Australia and Asia. And I think this is a very important issue just to make both countries closer. The third point is people. And I think there is a very good experience of Chileans studying in Australia. And I think both governments should work on how to have that mass of people that knows Australia, knows Chile, from Chile and for Australia, playing a better role in increasing our relationship. I think there is a very good prospect on that. And finally, well, of course, resources are important. Mining, we have the same kind of resources, and we have to have a very easy conversation about how to manage copper, lithium, and others. We are competitive, but I think both can benefit of a strong relationship. And also the very important subject of energy. So I put this point because I think we have to look at the future. Chile and Australia from both sides of the Pacific can have a contribution like what our government have done. I think the next ratification of Chile of the CTTP, which has been delayed, but I think it's very important, we could give a very strong impetus to Chile and Australian relations. What is your view, Mr. Minister?
Well, look, I certainly agree that we're not lacking for issues to work together on as countries, and the issues that you flagged, multilateralism, trade, Antarctica, cable routes across the Pacific, they're all significant agendas that we can pursue jointly. But I think the most important one that you flag is that fundamental to pursuing all of those agendas are the people-to-people connections. I was agreeing to Ambassador Powell, listening to him talk about that we know each other in Australia and Chile, and I certainly feel that way, that we know each other. Before coming to this country, I have many Chilean Australian friends in my electorate. There are tens of thousands of Chilean Australians who migrated to Australia, and I've had a pisco sour at a Chilean National Day with friends in Melbourne's West. So as I had last night at the Australian Embassy. So we have a very strong foundation. But also I think the really important part is that it's an intimate relationship as well. Australia, we are a multicultural nation. As I said, 2/3 of my constituents are either born overseas or a parent born overseas. And I always say that Australian multiculturalism works best when we learn from each other. all of the different migrant groups that come to Australia and bring their individual stories to make the one story of Australia, bring something different to the mix. And the thing that I've really noticed that Latin American Australians, particularly Chilean Australians, bring to the mix is a ferocious belief in democracy. It is valued in those Chilean Australian diaspora communities in a way that, frankly, some Anglo-Australian communities take for granted. And I often say, like, this is something we can learn from the Chilean Australian community, this passion for politics and for democracy. It's something that I like the other communities in Australia to embrace. So I feel very at home here. I feel like I know the Chilean people, and the more that we can promote those people-to-people ties in new ways in the next generation, the better for our national government relationship. So the new waves of students come and study in Australia. You'll have a blast. We are very welcoming. But for also working holiday visas, we have many visas available to young Chileans. If you want to take a year to holiday in Australia to see a magnificent country, natural environment that we have, earn some money on the way, work on English language skills. It's a great way to spend 12 months. And there are thousands of Chileans doing that now, and we're significantly expanding the number of people who are able to come. So I extend an invitation with open arms. Come and know Australia like we have known previous generations of Chilean Australians.
Thanks, Minister. I think we are running out of time, but well, do we have time for one last question? Alejandro, Professor Jara, who is also online.
Oh, thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, as well as to Patricio Powell's remarks. Briefly, the United States has been promoting in the region the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which seems to me like a very poor substitute for free trade arrangements or for free trade and better disciplines under the WTO. So what is Australia's view on this? And underlying the question, if I may add, is how to get back the United States back to the drawing board in Geneva. Thank you.
The IPEF is something that I've discussed with peers in the Indo-Pacific in Southeast Asia. And I think a common response when it's raised is that we need to articulate practical outcomes that can be achieved under IPEF. Add meat to the bones of what the proposal is. Australia has signed on to CPTPP, and we think that that's an agreement that is in our interests and that expands our trade relationships, particularly through Latin America. And that's a substantive agenda that delivers significant outcomes. That's an agreement that's been framed in a way that would allow the Americans in the US to come back into the agreement in the future. The Japanese, I think, have exercised very creative diplomacy to create that framework. So I think it's there if they come to it later in the piece.
Thanks, Minister. On behalf of the University of Chile, the Institute of International Affairs, I would like to thank you for your talk, and I would like to thank Ambassador Powell as well, and the Australian Ambassador Mercer. Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for as you can see, our young students, undergrad students, have a really interest for the relationship with Australia. So thanks.
Another activity with students.
Yes, so we